Perfect. I will try to get a broad overlook, a big context. I'm a memory studies expert. I'm a cultural historian. I've worked on television and other media, and I will try to look where we are practically and especially theoretically in this moment in the history of memory, and perhaps also where we want to go or where we should perhaps go, and how does Holocaust themes fit into it, or perhaps no longer fit into it. So it's going to be a fairly fast ride. Let's see if I manage that. I want to quickly look at cultural memory in principle. I want to look at digital politics because I think they're very important. Digital memory studies. I want to look a little bit more closely at the concept of immersion, and then compare cosmopolitan memory, that is the type of paradigm of memory that was important for Holocaust memory, and what I will want to call, and others have called, the memory of the Anthropocene, and see how the two are related or not related. As a point of departure, I want to use Anna Reading's category of register of how to analyze sites of memory. Any site of memory can be analyzed in terms of her terms. I've added the last three to it. So the question is, any given site of memory or any kind of cultural product aspiring to a site of memory, what's its reach, what's its speed, how easily can it combine across platforms, how stable is the message across different platforms and different cultural contexts. We've already talked about the importance of immersions. I come back to that, the sense of being present in this digital world for us. The question of interactivity, which I want to define here briefly as the ability to change the trajectory of a story, for example, in the process of using a product, in the process of consuming a story. I think that's very important. And for me personally, very important, and has always been very important with regard to Holocaust memory, is the potential and actual self-critical edge of a given memory product. One of the questions, we are negotiating these questions of Holocaust memory against the background of pervasive anxiety about what does it mean to do politics, to have political processes in the age of the digital, in the age of the algorithm. There are lots of different hypotheses out there, and there is absolutely no agreement. But the anxiety is part of our anxiety that's linked to the specific function that Holocaust memory has served, because Holocaust memory has been burdened with finding a solution to the political problems of the 20th century, especially fascism. And that challenge, of course, continues to exist. So I'm just looking here at that slide at different hypotheses that exist about digital politics: the echo chamber hypothesis, the radicalization hypothesis, my much optimistic hypothesis about democratization, the emotional charges that allegedly didn't exist beforehand to the same extent, and also the possibility that digital culture is depoliticizing large parts of the population and the electorate. That's an important background for us because it is linked to the civic duties that memory culture is supposed to fulfill. Immersion, we've already mentioned it. There is no agreement in the media theory philosophy what precisely immersion is. There are different approaches, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not. I want to highlight the intense emotional experience of immersion, the relationship between framing and unframing. That is, immersion is a media-induced experience of having a feeling of an unmediated experience, right? That is, I think, one of the nice ways to capture that immersion. Of course, is a spectrum, and it's in itself a relatively ambivalent, and it's actually also a relatively difficult to reach state for some people, at least. And then, of course, immersion is linked to all the questions and all the problems that are attached to our problems, that the lessening of critical distance, the presence of overwhelming stimuli, and the heightened emotional involvement. And again, important for our purposes, the focus on interaction. So immersion is one of the pivot points. It's one of the points that people try to understand. And one way to understand it is to historicize it. And I think then it becomes easier to understand it. I will come back to the historicization of immersion in a moment. Now I want to highlight some of the terms that have been important in the emergent field of digital memory studies. And here, the strategy of trying to understand digital culture has been to deconstruct many of the binaries that seem to apply to our culture in general. So in terms of, for example, the difference between past and present. One hypothesis, Andrew Hoskins and others have phrased it, is that past and present have a different type of relationship than they used to have. The same applies to the relationship between private and public memory. And very important also for our purposes, it might apply to the relationship in subjects and objects. It might apply to the relationship between machines and humans, and it might create some new subjectivity that is sometimes called the transhuman. That raises very important question about the function, the political, didactic, moral function of social memory processes. Very quickly, why immersion is so problematic and why it's so difficult to find an answer to develop immersive Holocaust products, why there is the taboo that exists, it still exists, and why we're talking about this, because for many years, for many decades, and for several generations, immersion was identical with fascist culture. One of the reasons that fascism was successful because it had allegedly a very immersive culture that was very conducive to creating a type of very destructive consensus in the German population and then also across Europe. One can discuss this from very different angles. It's maybe a problematic hypothesis, but it has been very important, and it has also been very important in creating a media response to fascism, because the response was, with regard to public television, with regard to documentary, with regard to film, was often an aesthetic of anti-immersion. And that is some of the legacies that we have to deal with. That fascism was immersive and that anti-fascism, therefore, has to be an aesthetic of anti-immersion. As I said, that might not be true, but that's one of our problems. Completely ironical, of course, the very fact that we have Holocaust memory, Holocaust studies and Holocaust memory in the way that we have it today is linked to a very immersive experience. That is the highly immersive television series Holocaust from 1979 in Germany, and the response in Germany, the massive outpouring of feelings, of self-criticism. That is to this day the gold standard of collective memory, the gold standard of self-critical memory, the gold standard of cosmopolitan memory. That is the idea that the dark past of the Holocaust has to be re-experienced. People have to be confronted with it at the sites of the crimes by way of film, by way of media, by way of documentaries, by way of eyewitness accounts, so that these catastrophes can be prevented from happening again. That is the essence of cosmopolitan memory that works under the sign of human rights. And that's still the established memory structure of Germany, of Europe, it's the official history of the EU. It's the kind of memory culture that we think has prevented similar catastrophes, especially in Europe, of course. But of course, immersion is everywhere. The Holocaust Memorial is immersive, both above ground and below ground, where the immersive atmosphere is created by making the exhibit darker and darker from one room to the next. Immersion is used everywhere. Here, for example, here's an example where it's used in the Bavarian State Criminal Investigation Office to find perpetrators guilty in order to prove to them, by way of an immersive digital product, that they had knowledge about what was going on in the camp and therefore have also been sentenced as a result of these immersive products. And then, of course, the already mentioned Call of Duty, which is, as other panelists have pointed out, a kind of a very strange way of going into the Holocaust immersively and at the same time pulling back. Our challenges are diverse now. They're differently. We are, of course, still in a cosmopolitan phase. Cosmopolitan memory, as I said, is very important. That cosmopolitan memory still is working with a national, also a very nationalistic memory. Right-wing memory culture is a challenge we have to deal with. That's very clear. But perhaps the most important political challenge is constructed differently. It's the history of the Anthropocene. It's the memory of the Anthropocene. How does that work? If memory culture wants to try to solve our political problems today, it has to work very differently with regard to time. It has to begin to create, to simulate interactively, immersively the results of our climate policies in order to imagine a catastrophe that hasn't happened yet, because we want to prevent it from happening. So time is turned upside down. Cosmopolitan memory was still very much focused on past catastrophes, yes, to prevent, but prevent their reoccurrence. The memory of the Anthropocene has to be structured differently. Here, we have to imagine the catastrophe which never happened and cannot be allowed to happen in order to prevent it from happening. So time is turned upside down. And the interesting thing is, I would argue, that we actually, in our digital cultural resources, we actually are very lucky because we have the type of tools, the playful, the immersive, the interactive, that we might be able to address this big challenge. People have never, humankind has never done that. They've never tried to solve the memory problem of the future in order to prevent it from happening. We've never done that. We've always been focused on the past. Now we have to focus on the future. And it's a very good question, what role the memory of the Holocaust can or cannot play in this context. So what I'm trying to do here by this slide is just to show the ambivalence here. When it comes to Holocaust, memory, we might have actually relatively good control over that. Yes, there are right-wing politicians, and they certainly need to be convinced. Yes, there are sometimes a problematic, right now, problematic dynamics between COVID deniers and Holocaust gestures. Some of them problematic, some of them very interesting and creative. But our challenge probably lies elsewhere. And Holocaust memory can be an example here. So what do we need? First, we need what I would call high scores on the reading scale, right? The one I've just talked about earlier. The reach, the speed, the combination, the immersion, the interactivity, the self-critical potential. That needs to function very well. It is only digital memory that can accomplish that, I would argue, because there is a qualitative plus when it comes, for example, to reach and speed. No other medium can really do this. We need this memory culture to be prefigurative, and it has to be counterfactual. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So there is one of these tensions with Holocaust culture, where we have always learned Holocaust culture is to prevent Holocaust denial. Now we need a memory culture that is counterfactual. So there is a tension that is difficult to solve. We need it to be entertaining education, and we need it to be self-disciplining. That's also a challenge that we might have solved with regard to Holocaust memory, but we need to solve it with regard to the memory of the Anthropocene. Very important, and this is what games and playing can do much better than other approaches. And this is so important for us. In games, we can play, we can experience complicity, what Michael Rothberg calls implicated subjectivity. We can play and experience that much, much better than in other types of narration, for example, in other types of products. Therefore, we do actually have the tools to solve the problems. Clearly, it has to be very, very prefigurative. I am hoping that memory culture becomes at the same time unburdened and becomes a reference point. Unburdened because I don't think memory culture is in and of itself, the way we have constructed it, the solution to the problem. We have put a lot of pressure on memory culture to solve political problems. I think we have to release memory, Holocaust memory, from that. I think Holocaust memory is linked to a specific phase in the history of media, to a specific phase in terms of politics, to what you want to call the second modernity. We're now looking at the third modernity. That's what we're trying to solve problems. So in that sense, there is a reduced pressure on Holocaust memory. And in that moment of reduced pressure, I think the questions of representational taboo will be much more relaxed. And then it's going to be much, much easier also to imagine the kind of Holocaust immersive culture, the kind of interactive culture, the kind of counterfactual culture where Holocaust can be experienced virtually in other ways than our mainstream institutions have permitted so far. That's at least that would be my hope. But then we have to use Holocaust memory again for the challenges of the future, and we should try not too longer to try to solve the problems of the past. Just a beautiful image at the end. These are the games. These are the games we need. This is not a very good game, I would argue, but those are the challenges we have to solve. And the question how Holocaust memory feeds into this or not is yet to be determined.